The clerk who found her car swore it wasn't there at midnight, and swore just as hard that it was there by 6 in the morning, parked exactly where Emily Coleman always parked it. Doors locked, keys nowhere in sight, nothing disturbed inside, as if the car itself had simply reappeared without her. If you are watching this from a small town, one where everybody still waves from their porch and nobody locks their back door, stay with us, because this is the case that changed how an entire region thought about the word safe. Before we go further, drop a comment below and tell us which city you're watching from tonight, and if this is your first time here, consider subscribing, because the story only gets harder to look away from. Bay City sits where the Saginaw River empties into the bay that gives it its name, a town of brick storefronts and old shipping warehouses that had spent the better part of a century adjusting to smaller and smaller versions of its own economy. By the fall of 2010, the shipyards that once built freighters for the Great Lakes had been gone for decades, and what remained was a patchwork of family businesses, church congregations that had shrunk but not disappeared, and a police department that handled mostly the small, forgivable disorder of a town its size. Nobody in Bay City expected a disappearance that would take 7 years to explain. Emily Coleman was 19 years old, and if you had asked anyone who knew her to describe her in one sentence, most of them would have used the word reliable. She worked the evening shift at a convenience store off Wilder Road, the kind of job that pays just enough to keep saving for community college classes. She was taking 2 at a time, aiming for an associate's degree in business administration. When detectives sat down with her mother, Carol Coleman, 3 days into the investigation, Carol kept circling back to small specific things, the way people do when the big picture is too much to hold at once. She told them Emily still slept with the reading lamp on, because she'd been afraid of the dark as a little girl, and never quite grew out of it, and that she left a glass of water on her nightstand every night, even though she never drank from it, an old habit from childhood nobody in the family had ever bothered to ask her about. She told them Emily had a laugh that came out too loud in quiet rooms, and that she always apologized for it, and that she'd cried the week before she disappeared because a customer had been rude to her at the register, and she'd taken it home with her the way she took everything home with her. Carol Coleman was not, in those early interviews, trying to build a case. She was trying to make sure that whoever was listening understood that her daughter had been a whole person, not a photograph on a flyer. And Frank Hodges would say years later that it was in that first interview, watching a mother describe her daughter's water glass, that the case stopped being a file number to him. Mark Coleman's account to investigators was quieter, but no less specific. He told them Emily had wanted to be the first person in the family to finish a 2-year degree, that she kept a spreadsheet of her savings taped inside her closet door, that she'd started talking, just a few weeks before she vanished, about transferring credits to a 4-year program in Lansing the following fall. He also told them something that would occupy investigators for weeks, that Emily had seemed distracted in the days before she disappeared, quieter than usual, and that once, a few days prior, he'd heard her arguing on the phone in her bedroom, her voice low and clipped in a way that wasn't like her. That single detail sent the earliest phase of the investigation down a path that would ultimately go nowhere, but not before consuming most of the department's first 2 weeks. Hodges and the Bay City detectives pulled Emily's phone records and found the call Mark had overheard. 11 minutes placed to a number belonging to a young man named Curtis Payne, 21, who had dated Emily on and off for about 4 months the previous spring, before she'd ended things. Payne worked at an auto parts store on the other side of town, and when detectives first brought him in, gave answers that struck Hodges as evasive, vague about where he'd been the night Emily disappeared, reluctant to explain what the phone call had been about, and visibly nervous in a way that experienced investigators learned to read as significant. For 9 days, Curtis Payne was the department's primary person of interest. Then his account began to firm up under a second and third round of questioning. The phone call had been about a shared cell phone plan the two of them had never fully separated after the breakup, a mundane billing dispute that Emily had, according to phone company records later subpoenaed, initiated herself. His whereabouts on the night in question were confirmed, after some reluctance on his part to involve her, by a young woman he'd been quietly seeing since the summer and hadn't wanted his family to know about yet. which explained the evasiveness that had briefly made him look guilty of something far worse than an awkward secret. The store's owner, a man named Gerald Watts, who had run the convenience store for 11 years, came under scrutiny next, not because of anything specific tying him to Emily's disappearance, but because a background check turned up a decade-old conviction for receiving stolen property, a fact that made investigators look harder at his relationship with his employees than they might have otherwise. Watts's account of the night was consistent from the first interview through the fourth. He had left the store at 9 that evening, well before Emily's shift ended, and had been at a bowling league 2 towns over with 11 witnesses who could and did confirm his presence until well past midnight. He was cleared formally by the end of October, though Hodges noted in his files that Watts had seemed almost offended by the suspicion, which in Hodges' experience meant less than people assumed it did. Plenty of innocent men are offended, and plenty of guilty ones learn to perform offense just as convincingly. A more difficult thread involved Patricia Owens, the overnight stalker who had waved to Emily on her way out, and who therefore became, by simple proximity, one of the last people to see her. Owens's initial statement to police was straightforward, but a neighbor of Owens's, interviewed independently as part of the standard canvass, mentioned that she'd heard Owens and her husband arguing loudly 2 nights before Emily disappeared, a detail that seemed irrelevant until investigators learned that Owens's husband had, years earlier, been the subject of a restraining order filed by a previous partner. It was a detour that took nearly 3 weeks to fully run down: interviews with the previous partner, with Owens's husband, with co-workers at his workplace to establish his whereabouts on the night Emily vanished. In the end, the connection was exactly what it appeared to be on the surface, and nothing more. A marriage under strain for reasons that had nothing to do with Emily Coleman, and a husband who had been 40 minutes away at his own job, confirmed by a supervisor and a time clock, when Emily walked out of the store. By the 3rd week, investigators had also looked hard at a customer named Dennis Frank, a man in his 40s who had been flagged by 2 different employees as someone who came into the store more often than his stated reasons seemed to justify, and who had on at least one occasion that a co-worker remembered, lingered at the counter talking to Emily longer than a typical transaction required. Frank was brought in, and his discomfort under questioning was immediate and obvious, though it turned out to have a source unrelated to Emily entirely. He was in the process of a contentious divorce, and was terrified that any police involvement, for any reason, would be used against him in a custody dispute already in progress. His alibi, once he understood that cooperating was in his own interest, checked out completely. A documented visit to his attorney's office that evening, time-stamped by the firm's own sign-in log. Each of these threads took real investigative hours, and each one, once exhausted, left Hodges with less to work with rather than more. By the 2nd week of November, with Curtis Payne, Gerald Watts, Patricia Owens's husband, and Dennis Frank all formally cleared, the department had run out of anyone in Emily's immediate orbit who fit any plausible profile of involvement, and the case entered the frustrating, open-ended phase that Hodges would later describe as searching for a shape in fog, the sense that whoever had taken Emily Coleman had left no seam at all in the fabric of her ordinary life, because he had never actually been part of it. Carol Coleman gave one more interview that fall that Hodges kept coming back to in the years afterward, not because it contained a new lead, but because of what it revealed about the shape of the search. Sitting in the department's small interview room in late November, she told him that the worst part wasn't imagining the worst things that might have happened to her daughter. It was smaller than that. It was thinking about how Emily always refilled the store's coffee pot before her shift ended, so the morning stalker wouldn't have to do it first thing, a task that wasn't part of her job and that nobody had ever asked her to do. It was the fact that, on the morning she disappeared, according to the store's own logs, the coffee pot had been refilled anyway, right on schedule, which meant that whatever had happened to Emily had happened after she'd already finished that last small, unnecessary kindness, and Carol Coleman said she thought about that detail more than almost anything else, because it meant her daughter's last completed act in the world had been an act of thinking about someone else. By the spring of 2011, the leads had run dry, and by that summer, the case had been formally reclassified as inactive. Though Hodges never closed the file in the way the paperwork suggested, He kept the box of evidence in his own office rather than sending it to Central.
If you're a fan of mystery cases, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel.
Storage, a small act of stubbornness that would matter enormously 3 years later. 210 miles was the distance, more or less, between the convenience store where Emily Coleman worked and a beauty salon called the Style Room on the east side of Saginaw. And it was a distance that meant nothing to investigators until the winter of 2013, when a laboratory technician working through a backlog of unsolved case evidence flagged something that would connect two files nobody had thought to connect before. But 3 years before that call came in, Saginaw investigators had already spent months trying and failing to explain what had happened to a young woman named Rachel Dunn. By the time investigators in Saginaw sat down to build the file on Rachel Dunn in July of 2007, they were working a case that on its surface looked nothing like Bay City's would look 3 years later. Not a quiet convenience store worker, but a young woman with a wide circle of friends, a full calendar, and as detectives quickly discovered, a small handful of relationships complicated enough to keep them occupied for months. Rachel's mother, Diane Dunn, gave her first statement to Saginaw detectives less than 24 hours after her daughter failed to come home, and what struck the responding officer most, according to his own notes, was that she kept apologizing for crying, as though grief itself were an imposition on the investigation. She told them Rachel had been the kind of daughter who called just to talk, no reason needed, sometimes twice in a single day, and that the silence since the night before had already felt unbearable, before anyone had used the word missing out loud. She described her daughter's hands, always faintly stained with hair dye, no matter how many times she scrubbed them, a badge of the job she loved, and the way Rachel hummed under her breath without noticing she was doing it, a habit that used to annoy her as a teenager, and that Diane said she would now give anything to hear again. She told them Rachel kept a small notebook of client names and their favorite color combinations, not because the salon required it, but because she wanted every woman who sat in her chair to feel remembered, and that she'd been saving for her own apartment, close enough to visit, but far enough to feel grown, a goal she'd been 11 months into achieving. The investigation's first real thread came from Rachel's ex-boyfriend, a 24-year-old named Bryan Ellis, whom she had dated for nearly 2 years before ending things that spring. Friends described the relationship's final months as tense, with at least 2 witnesses recalling a loud argument between Rachel and Bryan outside the junction in May, weeks before her disappearance. An argument heated enough that the bar's own bouncer remembered separating them. Ellis had a documented temper, a prior charge for a bar fight 2 years earlier, later dismissed, and when detectives first interviewed him, his account of his whereabouts on the night Rachel vanished was frustratingly loose, placing himself around town without specifics. He became, for nearly 3 weeks, the investigation's central focus. It was only after detectives pressed harder, and after a friend of his came forward independently, that a fuller picture emerged. Ellis had spent that night at a cousin's house 2 counties over, helping him move furniture ahead of a lease deadline, an alibi that had been slow to surface only because Ellis, embarrassed about how the breakup had gone and worried about how it would look, had been reluctant to volunteer that he'd spent the evening drinking and talking about Rachel with family, rather than doing anything more damning. The cousin and 2 other relatives present that night confirmed his account down to the hour. A second thread ran through a co-worker at the Style Room, a woman named Susan Blake, who had been employed at the salon for less than a year and whose relationship with Rachel had, according to 2 other stylists, grown noticeably cold in the months before the disappearance. When detectives asked why, the answers were contradictory in a way that took time to untangle. One co-worker said Susan had been jealous of Rachel's growing client list. Another insisted the tension had nothing to do with work at all, and everything to do with a man both women had, at different points, been involved with, though nobody could agree on who he was or how serious either relationship had been. Susan Blake herself, when interviewed, denied any real conflict and grew visibly upset at the suggestion, an emotional reaction detectives noted without being able to interpret cleanly. Genuine hurt and defensive guilt can look identical in an interview room. It took 3 additional interviews, spread across 2 weeks, along with phone records showing Susan had been on a call with her sister in a different city at the time Rachel was last seen, before the department was satisfied enough to move on. The most persistent lead, and the one that consumed the largest share of the department's resources that summer, involved a co-worker's uncomfortable account of a man who had come into the salon twice in June, asking specifically for Rachel by name, a stranger to the regular clientele, polite but oddly formal, who had on his second visit waited nearly 40 minutes past his scheduled appointment time without complaint, just to have her cut his hair rather than accept an earlier opening with someone else. The receptionist who took his information could only remember a first name, and even that inconsistently between her initial statement and a follow-up interview 2 weeks later. She said Gary in July and Greg in August, a discrepancy that detectives spent real time trying to resolve, cross-referencing the salon's paper appointment book, which had frustratingly been only partially filled out that month. No last name, no phone number, no address had ever been recorded, and by the time investigators tried to reconstruct the man's 2 visits, the salon's outdated booking system offered nothing more specific than initials scrawled in pencil that could have read either way. The lead went nowhere in 2007, not because it wasn't taken seriously, but because there was simply nothing solid enough to chase, and it would sit unresolved in the file for 6 years, a name that was not quite a name, attached to a man who was not quite a suspect. Diane Dunn gave her final interview of that first summer in September of 2007, 3 months after Rachel vanished, and told the lead detective something that never made it into any official summary, but that he wrote in his personal notes anyway because he said later, it felt wrong not to keep it somewhere. She said that Rachel used to leave the porch light on for her when she came home late, even after Diane had told her a dozen times it wasn't necessary, and that in the week since her daughter disappeared, she had not been able to bring herself to turn it off, not once, not even during the day, because some small, unreasonable part of her still believed that if the light went dark, that would be the moment it became real. What reopened both cases at once, 6 years later, was a genetic sample that had sat, largely overlooked, in an evidence locker the entire time, a partial biological trace recovered from underneath the driver's side door handle of Rachel Dunn's abandoned and recovered car in 2007, at the time too degraded and too limited in quantity to generate a usable profile with the DNA technology available to Michigan State Police laboratories that year. By 2013, forensic science had moved forward enough that a technician reprocessing a backlog of unresolved partial samples from the region managed to extract a workable profile from that 6-year-old trace. It didn't match anyone in the state's offender database, but when it was run against evidence collected in other open Michigan cases as a matter of routine cross-referencing, it produced a hit that made the technician stop and call her supervisor before she'd even finished writing up the report. A partial match, low but real, to material recovered from inside Emily Coleman's locked Pontiac Grand Am in Bay City in 2010. 2 women, 2 cities, 210 miles and 3 years apart. No connection to each other in life. Different schools, different social circles, no shared friends, no shared employer. Nothing that a normal victimology search would have flagged. And now, a single unidentified genetic profile linking both disappearances to whoever had touched Rachel Dunn's stolen car door, and whatever surface inside Emily Coleman's Grand Am had picked up a trace of the same person. Frank Hodges got the call on a Tuesday afternoon in February of 2013 and later admitted that his first reaction wasn't excitement, but a kind of cold, settling dread, because a single unidentified profile connecting 2 disappearances 3 years apart didn't suggest a resolution. It suggested a pattern. He drove to Lansing the next morning to sit down with the state crime lab and within the week to make the phone call that would bring the case its next chapter. A request for the Federal Bureau of Investigation's behavioral analysis support, and the beginning of a task force that would spend the next 4 years trying to answer a question that, on that February afternoon, none of them could have guessed would take until 2017 to finally close. Special Agent Diane Pierce arrived in Bay City on a Thursday in early March of 2013, driving up from the Detroit field office in a government sedan that looked deliberately unremarkable, and Hodges would later say that his first impression of her was that she asked more questions than she answered, which turned out to be exactly the quality the case needed. Pierce had spent 11 years with the Bureau's Behavioral Analysis Support Program, working serial predation cases across the Midwest, and she came to Bay City with a working theory she didn't share right away, that whoever had left genetic material at 2 separate scenes 3 years apart hadn't started with Rachel Dunn in 2007, and almost certainly hadn't stopped with Emily Coleman in 2010. Predatory patterns of that precision, she told Hodges over coffee in a diner 2 blocks from the sheriff's office, rarely begin fully formed. They usually have a history. The task force that formed that spring was small by necessity. Michigan State Police resources stretched across a rural post, Bay County's own limited detective bureau, Saginaw PD contributing a detective named Robert Hunt, who had worked the original Dunn case in 2007 and had never quite let it go, and Pierce commuting up from Detroit 2 or 3 days a week. Their first task wasn't glamorous. It was archival. Pierce had Hodges and Hunt pull every unresolved missing persons file for women between the ages of 18 and 26 across a widening radius of central Michigan, going back as far as records were digitized, looking for anything that echoed the shape of the 2 known cases: disappearances with no forced entry, no financial motive, no domestic violence history, and critically, no bodies and almost no physical evidence left behind. It took most of that spring and summer to build the list. Missing persons cases involving young women, they discovered, were unevenly documented across different county departments, some digitized back to the 1990s, and others still sitting in paper folders in courthouse basements. Hunt drove to 5 different county seats that June alone, sitting in records rooms with a legal pad, cross-referencing dates against known truck routes, festival calendars, and bar closing times, because Pierce's profile suggested their subject operated somewhere with regular, legitimate reason to pass through multiple small Michigan cities. By August of 2013, 2 names surfaced that changed the shape of the investigation from a 2-victim anomaly into something Pierce had been quietly expecting and dreading in equal measure. Karen Fowler's disappearance in July of 2001 predated Bay County's involvement by nearly a decade, and the file the Midland Police Department built that summer reflected an investigation working with far less than what Saginaw or Bay City would later have available. No cell phone records worth pulling since Karen didn't own one, no security cameras covering the textile plant's parking area, and a department of 18 officers handling a caseload that had never before included anything like a missing 20-year-old woman. Karen's mother, Sandra Fowler, worked the same textile plant her daughter did on a different shift, and it was Sandra who reported her missing when Karen failed to show up for a family dinner that Sunday, a standing tradition neither of them had broken in over a year. Sandra told the responding officer that Karen was saving toward trade school, hoping to become a hairdresser herself, a small detail that would go unremarked upon for 12 years, until Diane Pierce, cross-referencing victim files in 2013, noticed it sitting quietly alongside Rachel Dunn's actual profession and felt the first true chill of recognizing a pattern rather than a coincidence. Sandra described her daughter as fiercely punctual, someone who set 2 alarms even for a Saturday shift, who kept a jar of coins on her dresser, earmarked specifically for the school she was working toward, and who called her every single day at lunch without fail, rain or shine, sick or well, a call that never came on the day she vanished. The earliest suspicion in Karen's case fell on a coworker named Dale Watts, no relation to the Gerald Watts briefly investigated in the Coleman case, a man in his 30s who had, according to 2 other line workers, made Karen visibly uncomfortable in the weeks before her disappearance, following her too closely to her car after shifts and once cornering her near the break room in a way a witness described as not quite touching her but close. Dale Watts's alibi was thin at first. He claimed to have been fishing alone, a solitary activity that offered no one to confirm it. And for nearly a month, Midland investigators considered him their strongest lead. It was a fishing license renewal receipt, dated and time-stamped at a bait shop 40 minutes from the plant that afternoon, combined with the bait shop owner's independent recollection of chatting with him about the Tigers game on the radio, that finally moved him out of consideration. Though Sandra Fowler would say for years afterward that she never fully stopped wondering about him. A second, quieter thread involved Karen's older brother, Michael Fowler, and a disagreement within the family that surfaced almost by accident during a follow-up interview with an aunt, who mentioned that Karen and Michael had argued badly at a cookout 2 weeks before she disappeared, something about money Michael had borrowed and not repaid. Investigators brought Michael in for questioning twice. His account of the argument matched his aunt's, matched Sandra's, and matched a friend who'd witnessed it, a real but ordinary sibling conflict, resolved well before Karen vanished, with the loan repaid in cash the following week. Michael's alibi, a documented shift at a different employer 40 miles away, closed that thread within days. Laura Mills's family gave a similarly textured account in the fall of 2004, 3 years after Karen, and in a different county entirely. Laura's father, Richard Mills, described his daughter to Flint investigators as the family's fixer, the one who remembered every birthday, who'd taken a second job waitressing specifically to help cover her younger sister's braces, and who kept a running list, updated weekly, of little things she wanted to do once she'd saved enough: visit the ocean, learn to bake bread from scratch, take her mother somewhere warm in the winter. He told them Laura still called him Daddy at 24, unembarrassed, and that she'd left him a voicemail the morning she disappeared, a mundane message about picking up milk on his way home that he had never deleted and years later still hadn't. The restaurant where Laura worked employed a cook named Kevin Bird, a man in his late 20s with a minor history of confrontations with customers, whose relationship with Laura had, by 2 co-workers' accounts, soured that summer after he'd asked her out twice and been turned down both times. Bird's demeanor in his first police interview was defensive to the point of hostility, enough that the interviewing detective wrote in his report that Bird seemed like a man with something to hide. His alibi, a documented visit to a probation office tied to an unrelated prior offense, checked out precisely, time-stamped down to the minute, and cleared him within the investigation's first 10 days. A more emotionally difficult thread involved Laura's own boyfriend at the time, a man named Stephen Ray, whom 2 of Laura's co-workers described, in separate interviews, as controlling in ways that made them uneasy, checking in on her constantly during shifts, showing up unannounced at the restaurant, once arguing with her loudly enough in the parking lot that a customer complained. Richard Mills, when asked directly, admitted he'd never liked Ray and had told Laura as much more than once, a fact that made the early days of the investigation especially fraught within the family itself, with Laura's mother privately telling detectives she feared Richard's dislike of Ray had colored his willingness to consider anyone else. Ray was investigated thoroughly and ultimately cleared by a combination of a gas station receipt 11 miles away and a co-worker who'd been with him loading equipment until well past the time Laura vanished. Richard Mills gave his last interview to Flint police in the spring of 2005, nearly 6 months after Laura disappeared, and told the detective something that stayed with him long after the file went cold. That Laura had always left her porch light burning on nights she worked late, a small kindness to herself, so she'd never have to walk up to a dark house alone, and that in all the months since, he'd kept that light on every single night, waiting for a daughter who was no longer coming home to it. 4 women, 4 different Michigan towns, Midland in 2001, Flint in 2004, Saginaw in 2007, Bay City in 2010, each disappearance roughly 3 years apart, each involving a locked or abandoned vehicle recovered with the victim's essential belongings missing, and no trace evidence usable at the time of the original investigations. Pierce laid the 4 files across a conference table in the Bay County Sheriff's Office that August and said the sentence Hodges would later describe as the moment the case stopped being a mystery and became a hunt. Someone had been doing this carefully for at least a decade. Diane Pierce's first request to Hodges, before she ever looked at a single piece of physical evidence, was for every family interview on file, all 4 cases, start to finish. She read them in order twice and told Hodges something in that first week that he wrote down nearly word for word, that victimology built from police reports alone always missed the thing that mattered most, which was who these women actually were to the people who loved them. Because predators who operate this carefully, this quietly, for this long, are rarely looking for a type on paper. They're looking for something closer to an opportunity wrapped around a kind of person, trusting, routine-bound, unlikely to be missed immediately. And the fastest way to understand that pattern was to listen to the families describe, in their own words, exactly who had been taken from them. That spring, with Robert Hunt commuting up from Saginaw and the task force beginning to take shape, Pierce and Hodges made the decision to re-interview each family, rather than rely solely on decade-old transcripts. It produced almost nothing in the way of new physical leads. What it produced instead was texture, and Pierce would later say that texture was exactly what let her finally see the shape of the man they were looking for. Sandra Fowler, interviewed again after 12 years, told them something she hadn't thought to mention in 2001 because it had seemed unrelated at the time, that in the weeks before Karen disappeared, she'd mentioned, almost in passing, a customer at a gas station near the plant who'd struck up conversation with her twice, complimenting her in a way that made her uncomfortable enough to mention it to her mother, but not so alarming that either of them had thought much of it. Sandra couldn't describe him beyond older, maybe 40s, drove some kind of work truck, a detail that in 2013 laid alongside Diane Dunn's memory of a stranger who'd waited 40 minutes at the salon for Rachel specifically, and Richard Mills's recollection that Laura had once mentioned a regular customer at the restaurant who tipped generously and always sat at her section even when other servers were free, began to look like the outline of the same man, appearing at the edges of 3 different women's lives years apart, never quite crossing into anything a family would have thought to report. Richard Mills, in his second interview, added a detail he hadn't given investigators in 2004 because it had struck him at the time as unrelated gossip rather than evidence, that a co-worker of Laura's, a woman named Deborah Sharp, had mentioned once that a trucker who came through the area for deliveries had asked, half-joking, whether Laura worked every night. Richard hadn't known what to do with that memory in 2004, and it had simply faded, the way details do when nobody tells you they might matter. It was this pattern, 3 families, 3 separate decades-old memories of an unremarkable man who lingered at the periphery, never named, never reported as a threat, because nothing he'd done had crossed any line that would have justified alarm. That hardened Pierce's working theory that summer, a predator who spent time observing before acting, who was patient enough to let a target's own routine become the trap. The task force's early theory building ran alongside a parallel and less glamorous task, eliminating anyone in the 4 victims' overlapping circles who might explain the pattern without requiring a single unknown predator at all. It was Robert Hunt who pushed hardest on this front, arguing through the spring of 2013 that 4 cases this similar might still, despite everything, be coincidence layered on top of unrelated tragedy. That summer, Hunt cross-referenced the 4 victims for any shared acquaintance, any overlapping employer, delivery service, church or family connection. It produced exactly 1 person of shared interest, a traveling insurance salesman named Gordon Blake, who had, records showed, called on both the textile plant where Karen worked and the restaurant chain that employed Laura Mills within 18 months of each woman's disappearance. A coincidence disturbing enough that Hunt drove to interview him personally in July of 2013. Blake, by then in his 60s and visibly shaken to be connected to anything of the kind, produced detailed sales records, expense reports, and hotel receipts, placing him in a different state entirely during both disappearances, evidence his employer corroborated within days. The lead, promising for exactly 1 week, closed as quickly as it had opened, and the task force returned to the harder truth Pierce had suspected from the beginning. There was likely no shared acquaintance to find, because the connection between these women existed only in the mind of a stranger who had chosen each of them separately. It was in the middle of the summer of 2014, with the re-interview project largely complete, and the task force sitting on a folder of remembered strangers who had never quite become suspects, that Diane Pierce turned her attention to photographs. She had been the one. Months earlier, to raise the possibility that if their subject watched his targets before acting, the way every family's memory now suggested he did, he might have been present at public places often enough to have been caught, unknowingly, in someone else's snapshot. It was tedious work by design, requesting old photographs from bars, community events, and local businesses near each disappearance site, then sitting with a magnifying loupe and a growing headache, looking for a man who, by every account, had made a career out of being forgettable. Before the breakthrough came, there were false starts, and Hodges insisted those be documented as thoroughly as the real one, because he'd learned by then that the difference between a real lead and a false one often wasn't obvious until it had already cost you weeks. In August of 2014, a photograph from a Bay City street festival in 2009 turned up a man at the edge of a crowd shot who bore at first glance a striking resemblance to the build described in Sandra Fowler's memory of the gas station stranger, heavy-set through the shoulders, a certain stillness to his posture. The task force spent nearly 3 weeks tracking him down through the photographer's other shots and a local business's employee records, only to identify him as a retired postal worker named Harold Chandler, 71 years old, who had simply been standing near a funnel cake stand, waiting for his granddaughter, and who, once located, was mortified and cooperative in equal measure. He was cleared within days, but the process of chasing him down was, Pierce noted in her file, exactly the kind of dead end the investigation would need to survive many more of before it found the real one. The actual breakthrough came in September, when Pierce, working through a batch of digitized photographs donated by the owner of the Junction, the Saginaw bar Rachel Dunn had been in on the night she disappeared, noticed a man seated alone at the far end of the bar in 3 separate photographs taken over the course of that same evening in July of 2007, each time positioned to keep Rachel and her group of friends within his line of sight, his face turned just enough away from the camera to leave nothing but a blurred profile, a shoulder, the edge of a jaw. 3 weeks later, cross-referencing photographs from a community festival held in Bay City in October of 2010, taken only days before Emily Coleman disappeared, Pierce found a man at the edge of a crowd photograph outside a bar called Kirby's, standing near the entrance with a drink in his hand, watching a group of young women that included Emily, his face turned 3/4 away from the camera in a posture that, once seen, was impossible to unsee a second time. The forensic photo analyst, brought in from the state crime lab that November, could not offer a facial match given the image quality, but concluded the build, stance, and behavioral pattern were consistent enough to treat as the same individual. And for the first time in 4 years, the task force had a shape rather than a folder full of eliminated names. Not a face, not really. But a person who existed in the corner of 2 different photographs, in 2 different cities 3 years apart, watching women who would soon vanish without a trace. The 18 months that followed the photo match tested the task force's patience more than any phase before it, and it was in the middle of that stretch in June of 2015 that the case took the turn everyone had been quietly dreading since Pierce first laid out her theory of a patient, recurring predator. Nicole Barrett was 23 years old, working part-time at a hardware store in Midland while finishing a certificate program. Her roommate, a young woman named Ashley Chapman, gave the first and most detailed account of her to detectives, describing a friend who triple-checked door locks not from anxiety but from habit, who kept a running...
If you're a fan of mystery cases, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel.
Photo log of every rideshare and unfamiliar car she got into, a precaution her friends had teased her about for years, and that made her disappearance, when it came, feel to Ashley like a violation of the universe's basic rules. Nicole's mother, interviewed the same week, told investigators her daughter had been the most careful person she'd ever raised, someone who called to check in, not out of obligation, but because she genuinely wanted her mother to know how her day had gone, and that the silence after June 6th felt, in her words, like a phone that had simply stopped being able to ring. On the evening of June 6, 2015, Nicole left a graduation party held at a community hall on the edge of Midland, telling friends she was walking the 4 blocks home because it was a warm night and she liked the walk. She never arrived. Her phone's last recorded location placed her 2 blocks from the community hall, on a stretch of residential street with no working exterior cameras. Investigators looked hard in those first frantic days at a young man Nicole had been casually seeing for about 2 months, a hardware store coworker named Trevor Hines, whose alibi initially seemed shaky. He claimed to have been home alone, no one to confirm it. It was a neighbor's home security camera capturing Hines's car parked outside his apartment for the entire relevant window that cleared him within 4 days. A second early lead, a man who had approached Nicole at the graduation party itself and been rebuffed, was run down and cleared just as quickly, through witness accounts placing him at the party, until well after Nicole had already left walking home alone. The task force treated Nicole Barrett's disappearance as an active emergency from the first hour, in a way the earlier cases discovered years after the fact had never allowed. It produced one genuine piece of physical evidence. A gas station 2 miles from the community hall had a grainy camera that caught at 11:52 p.m. that same night a pickup truck with a covered bed pulling out of the lot roughly 4 minutes after Nicole's last phone activity, headed in the direction she would have been walking. The plate was unreadable in that footage, though a neighboring station's internal camera, angled toward the pumps, later captured a partial rear plate on a truck, matching the same general profile. 3 characters, a partial 4th, enough for state police analysts to begin cross-referencing registered vehicles. Nicole's disappearance also forced the task force's hand publicly. By August of 2015, Michigan State Police held a press conference confirming what investigators had suspected for nearly 2 years, that a still unidentified individual was believed responsible for a pattern of disappearances across central Michigan stretching back to 2001. The dedicated hotline logged over 1,100 calls in the first 6 weeks alone. Somewhere in that flood, in October, a woman named Deborah Sharp, the same coworker Richard Mills had mentioned in his 2013 re-interview, called in on her own, remembering the trucker who'd once asked, half-joking, whether Laura Mills worked every night. She still couldn't offer a name. The lead was logged and set aside, unmatched, one more thread among hundreds that fall. Ashley Chapman gave her final formal statement that summer and told detectives something that never left the file, that Nicole had texted her from the party less than an hour before she vanished, a simple message that said only walking home, nice night out, 3 words that would sit, unanswered forever, as the last thing her closest friend would ever hear from her. Diane Pierce's profile, a man comfortable in public spaces without drawing attention, likely with an occupation granting legitimate, unremarkable reason to travel between the 4 towns, pointed the group first toward long-haul trucking. Then, as Robert Hunt's list of 40-odd drivers with matching routes grew and shrank through 2015, toward a narrower category of regional independent haulers rather than corporate fleet drivers, since a man tied to a single dispatcher's schedule would have left more institutional footprint than their subject seemed to have. It was during this narrowing process that another false lead consumed real time and, briefly, real hope. In February of 2016, an analyst cross-referencing driver's license photographs flagged a 53-year-old independent hauler from Bay City whose build and general coloring matched the bar photographs closely enough that Hodges authorized discreet surveillance for nearly 3 weeks. The man, a widower named Roger Simpson, who drove feed deliveries through much of the same territory the task force had mapped, was watched, his financial and travel records quietly pulled, his history combed for any contact with the 4 known victims. He came back clean on every front. No route overlap with Karen Fowler's 2001 disappearance, documented presence at a hospital bedside with his dying wife during the window of Rachel Dunn's disappearance in 2007, and a life that, once fully examined, contained nothing but grief and an unfortunate physical resemblance to a man he had never met. Pierce would say afterward that clearing Simpson mattered as much as anything else the task force did that year, because it proved the group was still willing to let go of a name the moment the evidence stopped supporting it. Discipline that had kept the investigation from making the kind of mistake that destroys both a case and an innocent life. It was 1 month later, in March of 2016, working back through the same narrowed list, that an analyst flagged Walter Boyd for a second, closer look. And this time, unlike Roger Simpson, unlike Harold Chandler, unlike Gordon Blake and Trevor Hines, and every other name the task force had chased and released over 6 years. Nothing about him fell apart under scrutiny. Every record checked pulled him closer to the 4 towns and the 4 dates instead of further away. Walter Boyd's name did not immediately feel, to anyone on the task force, like the breakthrough it would eventually prove to be. Not after 6 years spent watching promising leads dissolve under closer examination. Hodges would later admit that in March of 2016, Boyd was one name among a dwindling handful still under consideration. What made him different was how quietly he fit, and how nothing about his life offered an easy explanation that let him go. He had no criminal record beyond a decades-old citation for an unpaid parking ticket. He was divorced, had been for nearly 20 years. His ex-wife, tracked down and interviewed discreetly that spring, described the marriage as quiet to the point of coldness. A man who kept his own schedule and rarely explained where he'd been, though she said almost apologetically that at the time it had never once occurred to her to think it meant anything sinister. Only that he was a private man who liked his own company more than hers. He lived alone on 11 acres outside Midland, land he rarely seemed to use for anything beyond storing equipment, and had spent the better part of 3 decades driving a flatbed truck for a regional company that supplied grain augers, feed processing parts, and irrigation equipment to farms and agricultural cooperatives across the middle of the state. Former co-workers, when interviewed, struggled to describe him in more than a sentence. Polite at a distance, private, someone people worked alongside for years without ever quite getting to know. That unremarkableness, Pierce reminded the group more than once that spring, was exactly what her profile had predicted from the beginning. The task force moved carefully through the summer of 2016, aware that a single misstep could destroy years of work. Surveillance authorized in June and run jointly by Michigan State Police and the FBI's Detroit field office tracked Boyd's routes and patterns without approaching him directly, a caution that cost time, but protected the case from any argument that investigators had tipped their hand too early. Financial records showed cash withdrawals timed to match gaps in his otherwise traceable movements. Fuel and toll records placed his truck within a several-mile radius of Bay City in October of 2010, of Saginaw in July of 2007, and close enough to Midland on the night of Nicole Barrett's disappearance that the partial license plate captured on the gas station camera in 2015 was sent for formal comparison against his registered vehicle. In September of 2016, that comparison came back as a match on 3 of the 4 visible characters, with the 4th consistent with, though not conclusively matching, the remainder of his plate. It still wasn't enough for an arrest that could survive a courtroom, and Pierce insisted the group resist mounting pressure from the public and from within their own agencies to move too early. What the task force needed was something connecting Boyd directly and physically to one of the women, and it was a warrant executed in November of 2016 on a storage unit he rented under a business name, in a small facility outside Midland that finally gave them that connection. Inside, alongside legitimate equipment parts and tools related to his hauling business, investigators recovered a locked metal box containing a small collection of personal items, a hair clip, a watch with a cracked face, a single earring, a laminated community college identification card, each of which would, over the following weeks, be matched to one of the missing women. Karen Fowler's identification card was among them. So was a watch belonging to Rachel Dunn, one her mother identified without hesitation from a photograph, having bought it for her daughter's 21st birthday 6 years before she disappeared. Walter Boyd was arrested on the morning of December the 3rd, 2016, at a truck stop outside of Midland, taken into custody without incident, the culmination of a case that had begun with a single locked, undisturbed car in a Bay City parking lot 6 years earlier. He did not speak during his arrest and invoked his right to an attorney within minutes, and for the following several months the investigation shifted from identification to the far harder work of finding out what he had done and to whom, across 16 years that stretched back further than even Karen Fowler's 2001 disappearance. The search team that arrived at Walter Boyd's 11 acres outside Midland in late January of 2017 worked in conditions that would test even experienced forensic personnel, temperatures dropping into the single digits some mornings, the ground frozen hard enough in places that the cadaver dog's handlers worried the scent work itself might be compromised. The team's lead handler, a state police canine officer named Craig Sims, who had worked with his dog for 6 years by that point, would later describe the first alert as almost anticlimactic in its quietness. His dog, a Belgian Malinois named Recon, simply sat down in a stand of pines, roughly 200 yards from Boyd's house, and would not move, a signal Sims had learned over 6 years to trust completely. What followed was slower and more methodical than the public imagination of a body recovery tends to allow for. Ground-penetrating radar, operated by a technician brought up from a state crime lab that had only acquired the equipment 18 months earlier, mapped subsurface anomalies across nearly 4 acres before excavation ever began, a process that took the better part of 3 weeks on its own. The forensic anthropology team, 5 researchers and graduate students from a university partnership, the state police had established specifically for cases involving skeletal remains, worked each site with hand tools, once heavy equipment had cleared the initial overburden, a pace that frustrated some in the department who wanted answers faster, but that Diane Pierce insisted on protecting, reminding anyone who complained that every family waiting on the other end of this excavation deserved evidence collected carefully enough to survive a courtroom, not rushed toward a headline. The first confirmed remains, recovered in early February, belonged to a woman whose dental records matched no one on the task force's existing list at all, and for several days that discovery generated more anxiety than relief among investigators, because it meant the true scope of what Boyd had done might extend well beyond the 4 women they already knew about, from the 4 connected disappearances. It would take 3 more weeks and a wider search of missing persons databases across neighboring states before that particular set of remains was identified as belonging to a 21-year-old from 90 miles south, whose own family had spent over a decade believing she'd simply walked away from them. Karen Fowler's remains were recovered on February the 11th. Identified within 9 days through comparison against a DNA sample Sandra Fowler had voluntarily provided years earlier during the re-interview project, never fully understanding at the time why investigators wanted it. Hodges made the call to Sandra himself, rather than delegating it, driving the 40 minutes to Midland to deliver the news in person rather than over the phone, a decision he later said he never regretted, despite how difficult the drive had been. Sandra would tell a reporter months afterward that even confirmation of the worst possible outcome had given her something she hadn't had in 16 years, which was an end to the specific and exhausting work of hoping. Laura Mills was identified on February the 23rd. Richard Mills, when Hodges reached him, asked only one question before anything else, whether his daughter had suffered, a question Hodges could not honestly answer with certainty, and that he handled, by his own account, as gently and truthfully as the moment allowed. A second set of unconnected remains recovered. That spring belonged to a woman in her late 20s whose 2005 case had been misfiled for over a decade as a voluntary disappearance rather than a suspected crime. Their identification, through DNA comparison against family reference samples, expanded the confirmed timeline of Boyd's crimes back to at least 1999, 2 years earlier than the task force's original theory, and brought the total number of confirmed victims to 9, all 6 from the Midland property, plus Rachel Dunn and Emily Coleman, whose remains had not yet been located. It was Boyd himself, in a partial and clearly calculated confession offered through his attorney, in exchange for prosecutors taking the death penalty off the table, who told investigators in the summer of 2017 that he had used a second, more remote location for what he called, without apparent remorse, the ones closer to town, a wooded parcel of state land near the Saginaw County line he had driven past for years on his delivery routes and knew to be rarely patrolled. Unlike the Midland property, which Boyd owned and had used at his own pace over years, the state land near Saginaw was land he had only visited, meaning the burial sites there were shallower and less systematically arranged. In Emily Coleman's case specifically, the site was disturbed enough by years of freeze and thaw cycles that recovery took nearly 2 full weeks of careful, gridded excavation. Rachel Dunn's remains were recovered there first, in early August. Emily Coleman's were recovered days later. Carol Coleman was informed of her daughter's identification on August the 9th, 2017, nearly 7 years to the week after Emily clocked out of her shift on Wilder Road, and Hodges, who had personally driven to deliver that news as he had for every family before her, later said it was the hardest visit of his entire career. Nicole Barrett's remains were the last recovered, found in September of 2017 in a shallow section of the same wooded parcel, separated from the others by a distance Boyd would only describe when pressed as far enough. Investigators believed her death and burial had occurred within days of her June 2015 disappearance, meaning that for over a year afterward, as the task force built its case around him, Boyd had been living and working within a normal radius of the very investigation closing in on him. Walter Boyd's trial began in February of 2018 in Bay County, moved briefly to a neighboring jurisdiction for jury selection due to the volume of local media coverage the case had drawn over its final 2 years. Prosecutors presented 9 confirmed murders spanning 1999 to 2015, built on physical evidence from the storage unit, the 2 burial sites, financial and travel records establishing his presence near each disappearance, and portions of his own partial confession. Diane Pierce's testimony on the 4th day of the trial ran nearly 3 hours, longer than any other witness, and jurors would later tell reporters that it was the section of the case that stayed with them most, not because of forensic detail, but because of the way she walked them through the re-interview project of 2013, reading portions of Sandra Fowler's and Diane Dunn's and Richard Mill's own words back into the record. The porch light left burning, the coffee pot refilled on schedule, the jar of coins, nobody could say what it was for anymore. The prosecution had made a deliberate choice, one Pierce had advocated for from the beginning, to let the victims remain people throughout the proceedings rather than becoming, as she put it in a pre-trial meeting, 9 sets of remains and a spreadsheet of dates. Robert Hunt's testimony covered the years of dead ends more than the breakthrough itself, and under cross-examination, Boyd's attorney pressed him hard on the false leads, Gordon Blake, Harold Chandler, Roger Simpson, trying to suggest that a task force willing to suspect that many wrong men over 6 years couldn't be trusted in its final conclusion either. Hunt's answer became one of the trial's most quoted exchanges, that every one of those men had been cleared because the evidence cleared them, and that Walter Boyd was standing trial for exactly the opposite reason, because 6 years of trying to clear him had done nothing but confirm him at every turn closer. Deborah Sharp's testimony was brief, but devastating in its simplicity. She told the jury about the conversation she'd had with a polite stranger in a diner more than a decade earlier, a man who'd asked, almost in passing, whether Laura Mills worked every night. When the prosecutor asked her gently whether she recognized the man sitting at the defense table, she looked at Walter Boyd for a long moment before answering that she couldn't be certain after so many years, but that something about the stillness of him felt familiar in a way she wished it didn't. The defense's strategy rested less on contesting the physical evidence, which by trial was extensive, than on challenging the completeness of the state's case. It was an argument that struggled against the sheer accumulation of the case's 13 years, 9 women, 4 confirmed disappearance sites, a storage unit containing personal items belonging to 4 of them, 2 burial locations Boyd himself had led investigators to, and travel and financial records placing him within a narrow radius of every disappearance across 16 years. The jury deliberated for just under 11 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all 9 counts of murder in April of 2018. Walter Boyd was sentenced to 9 consecutive terms of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. In the years since, the task force dissolved gradually rather than all at once. Robert Hunt retired from the Saginaw Police Department in 2020, the Dunn case having been, as he told a local reporter, the first file he ever refused to let go cold and the last one he ever needed to close. Frank Hodges remained with the Michigan State Police for 4 more years, working other cases, but keeping, until the day he retired, a single photograph on his office wall, not of Walter Boyd, but of the 2 blurred bar photographs side by side, the ones that had finally given a shape to a man who had spent 16 years being nothing at all. Diane Pierce returned to the Bureau's behavioral analysis program and has spoken, in the years since, at several law enforcement training conferences about the case, using it as a teaching example of why victim-centered reinvestigation can surface connections that evidence alone sometimes cannot. For the families, the years since 2018 have moved at a different pace entirely. Sandra Fowler still keeps a jar of coins on her dresser, the one Karen had been saving toward trade school. Though she has never been able to say what she's saving it for now, Diane Dunn's porch light still burns every night. She has spoken publicly only once since the trial, at a candlelight vigil held in Saginaw on what would have been Rachel's 34th birthday, telling a small crowd that her daughter had spent her short life trying to make other people feel a little more seen, and that the least the rest of them could do now was remember her exactly that clearly. Richard Mills never did delete the voicemail about picking up milk. Investigators across Michigan quietly began reviewing older missing persons files in the years following Boyd's conviction, aware that a man capable of operating undetected for 16 years across a rotating, unremarkable route might have left behind cases even a 9-victim total had not fully accounted for. As of this recording, no additional victims have been confirmed, though the file, unlike so many of the individual cases that made it up, has never been formally closed. Carol Coleman still lives 2 blocks from where Emily once worked. She has said in the years since the trial that the hardest part was never the not knowing. It was learning, finally, exactly how close her daughter had been to being found for 7 long years, and exactly how far away justice had still managed to be. This video is a work of fiction created for educational and entertainment purposes. Any resemblance to real persons, living or deceased, or to actual events, is purely coincidental. Names, locations, and details have been created for narrative purposes and do not depict real individuals or investigations.